Hello, and welcome to the inaugural OK podcast, where three friends sit around and talk mostly about cardboard and cardboard accessories. I thought it was a good idea to start a podcast about things I enjoy, but God knows I can't hold a conversation with someone else, let alone myself. So I have two of my good friends here, Yichin and Kenny, to discuss ideas while I sit and nod in agreement. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves? Starting with Kenny?
Sure. So I'm Kenny. You might know me as KP from around different places on the internet to do with Flesh and Blood. So I played in the Calling in Sydney and made the top eight, which is where I kind of started. And from there, most people know me because I made the original TTS mod, which helped a lot of people play during the COVID period. And I also used to write for Channel Fireball as well. I've got a long history of competitive card game playing and competitive miniature game playing. Not going to bore everyone with that. I wrote it in my Channel Fireball article, but that'll do. But that's me in a nutshell. I enjoy talking a lot, so why not talk with some friends?
I am Yichin. I have a much less prolific resume than Kenny here. For the most part, my sort of card game experience comes from playing Magic for about 10 years. I judged for it for about 5 years. I am no longer a judge. And my main interest in cardboard games that goes for board games and card games is talking about design and development of those games. So yeah, just kind of wanted to see what we can do about getting our thoughts out here.
Nice. And my name is Oliver. I have even less experience than everyone else here. I've just played in some skirmish events, and now I think I'm hot shit because I got some participation prizes. So
Didn't you play in GP once?
no, that was my brother. He won a junior super series. He
Okay,
got
well that's close enough, right?
$500.
Oh
Wow.
wow,
Oh
that's
no.
impressive.
Big money.
I've never won any money playing Magic or any other card game, so that's pretty impressive.
Where'd you hear that
I won a fair bit of money.
Hmm. Well, that is me because I don't have anything else to add. All right. So how about
So we're gonna be talking about FAB, right?
I think so.
For the most
Okay.
part, yeah. So for those who are listening to this, they probably already know, but we're talking about the Flesh and Blood trading card game by Legend Story Studios, which is something that all three of us have at least dabbled in a fair bit.
Mhm.
Right.
And specifically, we're talking about the Monarch set that is coming out soon. As of this podcast, I believe it will be a week or so until release. That sounds about right. 1 week, 1.5 weeks.
1.5, I think.
Yeah, date of recording this podcast. I imagine by the time this podcast is out, it will probably be released or very shortly thereafter.
You underestimate my uploading skills. We'll see. All right.
See, just wanted to give you guys a disclaimer. Right now, we are operating under a incomplete spoiler. So as of this moment, we still have about a third of the set to be revealed. They haven't scheduled a official reveal for those cards, so who knows when they'll show up. But we figured might as well just talk about them now.
All right.
That's right. So our opinions are extremely informed and entirely accurate.
Yes, absolutely.
I know there's 4 heroes. That's about it. All right. So, how about moving on to some initial Monarch thoughts? Ichin, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I guess we'll start here since me and Kenny's I guess position on Monarch is pretty
Diametrically
stark.
opposed.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start off with the good stuff. I really like a lot of the aesthetics and designs of Monarch. For the most part, I am super into that light versus shadow type stuff. There are some bits of Monarch that I am more hesitant of. Not necessarily the talent system, but mostly it's on what was promised to be delivered with Monarch and how well they delivered that. I have nothing to say bad about the spoiler season or anything about that, or honestly any of the hero designs. They're all great. But I do think there are a lot of expectations for Monarch that might not have been met. And I guess Kenny can go into more detail about that.
Well, yeah, certainly there are a lot of thoughts I have about Monarch. I'm not going to delve into them right now, or we're going to take up the rest of the hour-ish podcast with just my thoughts. But I would say that my initial thoughts about Monarch originally, when I was talking about Monarch, a couple months ago, I felt like this was quite an important set for Flesh and Blood. It's really the first set that's come out after all of the hype and now that everyone's in the game. So I feel like there was a lot riding on its shoulders, effectively. And I don't, at least for me, it really hasn't met a lot of that stuff. So I have a lot of thoughts about the trait system and individual hero design, trait or talent. Sorry, I always forget what they're called. But for me, I think the most striking thing is that when I look at Monarch cards, it really just looks like an entirely different game. With some exceptions, there are certainly some cards in the set that remind me that I'm playing Flesh and Blood. But I remember looking at the first few cards that were spawned, like Eclipse, for example, and just, not understanding anything on the card.
Mm-hmm.
That was
that's what was exciting about
surprising.
it, right? That's what was exciting about it. Like I remember Eclipse and Doomsday were spoiled, and everybody had no clue what any single line on that card meant, and it was kind of like a pregnant pause where everybody's holding their breath to see what exactly these new mechanics are and what did they do. So I kind of. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I can appreciate that. I can appreciate the excitement that unknown brings, because obviously people like fresh new mechanisms. But for me, I think a big part of Flesh and Blood's appeal was that kind of core experience of what was happening. And I feel like the introduction of so many different things in this set is going to dilute that a little bit. But we'll save that for when we're talking about it a bit more later on.
Sounds good. Let's go over the traits, because I actually really like the trait system. Mostly because my expectations going to the Monarch were that they would add 4 more classes and not have any sort of trait system. So my expectation for the game was that the game would continue to expand horizontally, and new heroes would not get very much outside of the occasional supplemental set or the occasional a generic card that they would play. So the trait system, especially looking forward and seeing the game where it's going to go a couple years into the future, where we have a bunch of traits and they're constantly being supported, it seems like a kind of a concession where you're going to have more heroes have more added to them per set than you normally would if you just had classes.
I just want to jump on and talk about the term horizontal you used there, because I'm glad that we use that the same. I got into a discussion recently with a couple of people, and we understood the concepts, but we actually use vertical and horizontal differently. So just to make sure that I understand and we're on the same page, when we talk about horizontal versus vertical game design, vertical game design is talking about depth within the things that already exist. So, for example, Crucible of War was a vertical expansion in a sense, because it added cards to things that had already existed.
Mm-hmm.
Am I correct?
Yeah.
Whereas in Monarch, there is a little bit of, there's not as much as you were saying. I won't get into all of it, but there was a little bit of horizontal expansion with some vertical, in the sense that there are now talents where there wasn't before.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, there is also the Illusionist class where there wasn't before. However, on top of that, they did introduce new things for Runeblade, for Warrior, and for Brute. So there is some level of vertical expansion on top of the generic cards as well.
Exactly. In the hypothetical alternate universe Monarch set where they introduce 4 completely new classes and no talents at all, that would be a completely horizontal expansion. Where
with the exception of the generics, but yes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. I'll save my thoughts on it. Why don't we hear a bit more from our host?
Host? I'm just sitting here nodding. I thought that's what I introduced myself as. Yeah.
I mean, you're a player, right? You know what the set is about. What do you think?
From a casual standpoint, I really like the flavor of the set. I really like the theme. I like this light and dark aesthetic. But yeah, I think I'll get into like some more of my gripes about talents later. But for now, I feel like it's a little bit unfinished, and it feels kind of messy. But
yeah, I think their implementation of the talents, given the near universal either ambivalence or kind of revulsion against them, probably could have been implemented better. Mostly because it's a new axis of kind of card design that was not hinted at all. I guess hinted at minimally in the first 2 sets. and wasn't something that was on players' minds going into the game when they first bought into Arcane Rising and Welcome to Wraith. So I definitely think that the talent rollout system, if it was going to be in the game, they should have had small hints of it in the beginning when they were first introducing classes, just as a have Rhinar be a savage brute or have a Doranti be a light warrior, that sort of thing. I think that would have been a lot more. That would have made a rollout a lot more smoother with Monarch.
I 100% agree with you. So I want to focus on some positives for a little bit. So before I get into my sea of complaints, but I do want to say that I do think talents over the longer term for the game will be quite good, and I totally agree with what you were saying, Yichin, about it being better than just continually expanding with classes. Talents obviously allow for crossover. So, when we have a light warrior, a light brute, a light guardian, or I should say, if we have them, but presumably at some point there will be a light brute or a light guardian. There will be cards that will cross over into all of those pools, which is much better than simply making individual pools for all of these different classes. If there were 20 classes, each pool would be fairly shallow, which would not be great. So I think that talent introduction as a concept is a good thing, but I agree that the rollout could have been much better. I think back to the World of Warcraft TCG, where they did have talents from the first set, to be fair, but they could have easily done something, like you said, by simply making, Rhinar a savage brute or whatever talent. Because at the moment, it just makes the first 8 classes feel a little bit. So the first 8 heroes, so Azalea, Rhinar, Bravo, etc. It just makes them feel a bit bare. And if you compare their card pool to the 4 new heroes, or 3 new heroes, I should say, because the Illusionist is a little bit smaller, their card pools are just smaller, which makes it feel like it wasn't planned. And that's kind of what I meant as well when I earlier said that Monarch almost looks like a different game. I know LSS has talked a lot about Monarch being part of the plan from the start, but it really doesn't seem it. It looks so wildly different from everything else, and it's clear that they're introducing a lot of new mechanisms that just don't feel like they were planned for originally.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'll say about the legacy, or I guess we're calling them legacy heroes now, the first 8 heroes that were released, they definitely feel like not really bare bones to me, but they feel like almost tutorial heroes. Like you're starting a game and you get these first 8 heroes, and these are your kind of basic, super generic heroes to introduce concepts of the game to you. And then after that, you have these following releases where you're actually getting into the interesting stuff.
Like it gets more complex and everything with all your.
It gets more complex, but they feel like it's hard to describe it. They feel like onboarding heroes. Like I'm getting like a slow. I'm like at some sort of presentation, and before they introduce hard concepts, they just start off with the basic stuff, so that I'm actually used to the game before I get into, or actually get my toes wet into the game.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah,
Sorry.
You go, Oliver.
Yeah, at least for me as a smooth brain, if I don't want to deal with that light and dark shenanigans, I could just play the regular heroes. Because I know there's like some light and dark hate in the set. But if you don't want to deal with that, even though if like someone's like super dominating the meta, maybe like Shadow Rune Blade, you can still play the basic 8 heroes and not have have to worry about the anti-light cards. So that's one thing.
Yeah, and I fully anticipate the first 8, or I guess 9 if you include Ira, and I guess some of the other Blitz heroes. I
Like
fully anticipate
Kasai.
them, I fully anticipate them to continue to be forces in the meta. At least for a long time going forward, especially because they were able to theoretically pump up their individual hero design a lot more compared to the talented heroes, where they're more careful because they have access to the entire 2 different pools of cards rather than one pool of cards.
You feel as though the core 8, legacy 8, whatever, at base on the stronger end, because they only have access to the 1 pool of cards as compared with the light heroes.
Yeah, I definitely think so. If you I guess the easy one to point to is Rhinar versus Levia, right? Where Rhinar clearly has a ability that is benefits almost all of his cards, and
Mhm.
is very strong once utilized, whereas Levia is extremely niche and only benefits her when she's using a specific pool of cards.
Yeah,
Same with
so
Chain and same with Bolton. All of them have their mechanics that are just listed on there, whereas their regular counterparts are more general playstyle with more general payoffs.
sure, I think that more general playstyle is more a consequence of the fact that they don't have a trait rather than intentional design. At least that's my feeling. I I would agree that I think, is it pronounced Levia? Was that what we ended up on?
Oh
Someone
yeah,
pronounced it at some
that's
point.
right. That's right. Somebody on the FAB TCG channel pronounced it Levia as in Leviathan.
Yeah,
But I'm just gonna call her Levia. I am a
yeah,
rebel, so
sure. Well, I'll just go with Levia because that's the official pronunciation.
okay.
But with Levia, I agree that her ability is just simply mitigating a downside. That's
Mhm.
really all her ability is. So I totally agree that it's certainly on the weaker side when compared with Reiner, for instance. I don't know if I agree with that with it's Chase and Bolton, right?
Chain.
Chain. So
Mhm.
I feel as though Chain's ability is actually very powerful. Like free go again is pretty
Mhm.
insane. And yes, it's true that he is obviously that comes with downside, but he doesn't have, I guess, an inherent. Well, the blood debt is an inherent downside if you play it, but
Yeah.
you could. Let me just look at his hero card again.
Doesn't cost anything to activate.
It doesn't
But
cost anything to make.
yeah.
So if you don't play any blood debt cards, just as an example, if you play 0 blood debt cards in your deck, he has no inherent downside.
I mean, he
Unless you,
banishes his deck,
yeah,
but
but that's what I'm saying. Unless you actually activate the abilities, right?
correct.
Yeah. I feel like Chain is much stronger than Levia on first look, and I also think that Bolton is actually very strong as well. That's kind of my first impressions of them. So I don't actually feel as though they're necessarily weaker than, say, Viserai or Dorinthia. I think they're different, and their playstyles are different, which is good, but they don't strike me as necessarily weaker.
I wouldn't say they're weaker, but their strengths are more niche in that they're clearly designed to be used with a specific pool of cards, and it's unlikely that this pool of cards will get too much support outside of their in the class pool that they can draw from. Like with Reinar, all you need is basically a card that discards in order to be able to be used by him or potentially used by him to great effect. With Levia, with Levia, you have to have a Blood Debt card, obviously, and they're probably not going to print too many Blood Debt cards in Brute. They'll print them in Shadow, but not in Brute.
Just
So,
opening, just opening up the gallery again so I can refer to card names more accurately.
oh yeah, definitely. And
Continue.
yeah, and it's the same with Chain as well, where it's very clear that any Runeblade card that's good will probably be played by Chain. But specifically to mitigate his downside, he wants to play Shadow Runeblade cards or Shadow cards. So their effective pool of cards, not hard pool of cards, but their effective pool of cards is much less likely to increase with additional Runeblade or Brute cards than Reinar or Viserai is.
And this actually lends into my biggest problem with the set. But before we talk about that, I thought I'd pass over to our host again. Is there anything you wanted to add to that bit?
Nope. You guys are good. Continue. I'm sitting here nodding.
Alrighty.
I'm following along. Don't worry about it.
Alrighty. So I'm going to jump on and I'm going to talk about the trait system a little bit more and what I think is easily my least favorite part of the set, and that is trait class cards. So I'm not talking about trait cards separately. So light, shadow by themselves, fine, not an issue. But the moment that we have Shadow Brute or Shadow Runeblade, that's where this set really lost me. So to talk about why I have a problem with that, I'm going to mention the effective card pool stuff that you were talking about, right? In the sense that it's true that Chain and Chain, Bolton, and Levia. Prism I can't talk about as much because Prism is the only illusionist right now. So obviously, she doesn't have more access than anyone else. But Chain, I'll get there. Chain, Levia, and Bolton all have access to all of the cards in their class in addition to the trait class cards. So they do have a bigger pool of cards.
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, as you said, that as Yichin said, sorry, their effective pool, that is the cards that they're actually quite good with, is smaller than the whole pool. However, the fact of the matter is that they can still access the whole pool. So if there is a random card out there that is good in, say, Core Runeblade, for example, and I'm certain that there will be a couple that will be good in Chain, he can access them. Whereas the opposite is not true. So if there's a good card in Shadow Runeblade and Viceroy wanted to access it, he just can't. So they have artificially larger card pools for seemingly no reason. They could have easily just done away with, say, the shadow text on the cards. And I understand that there are cards that mention shadow specifically, and they needed the trait or something like that. But the fact of the matter is that there might have been one or two shadow Runeblade cards that might have been interesting in Viceroy that are just completely forbidden to him. On the flip side, for Chain, he can access any of the fringe cards in Runeblade that might actually be useful for him. So it's just not a reciprocal relationship in that sense. I don't understand why they needed to hard gate cards when they could have soft gated them.
So let's actually get into this kind of larger picture thing with LSS design, because I think a lot of their design decisions in Monarch tie into the idea that they do not want a rotating pool. So when you have like soft limitations and stuff, with every set you release, right, you can't obviously as a developer predict how players will use your cards. And it's obviously going to be some cards eventually that are going to be broken that you had no clue or didn't actually test the interaction for. If you're committed to the goal of having no rotation, which is having a flat power level for the most part, then it makes sense that they want to hard gate cards so that there's little chance where that cards that make it out of exist outside of this hard gated card pool are balance nightmares and potentially ban worthy. That's my take on it. I'm not sure if I agree on it, but I see where they are coming from with the concessions they make in the design of their game to the philosophy driving the design of everything outside the game.
While I can understand that argument, I would say that it does seem to run a little bit against the whole non-horizontal expansion thing we talked about. Because basically, when you introduce Light Warrior to the game and you introduce, Shadow Brute, etc., even though they're not a new class, they effectively are. And so until there comes a point where there is a second Light Warrior, which, when is that going to happen? Is that going to happen in Kingdom? If that happens in Kingdom, then do the other classes just get ignored for a little bit longer?
Ooh, I hope not. It'll probably be the supplemental set. That's my guess, at least.
Well, Kingdom is the supplemental set, right?
No, that's the second set. It's the Arcane Rising.
Oh, yes, it's the Arcane Rising equivalent. Okay, so it'll be Kingdom and then whatever the set after that is. But I guess I also then wonder, how long until again we see light cards? How long till we see Light Warrior cards? Are there ever going to be more Light Warrior cards? If there aren't going to be more Light Warrior cards, then it's almost like they're just specialization bolted. You know what I mean? I understand that they can print more Light Warrior heroes, but it seems overly restrictive when I think a soft restriction probably would have done it. I do agree that there are things that slip through the cracks, and obviously the history of collectible card games can really show that there are a lot of times where developers and designers have missed things, like Oko in Magic.
Yeah, Oko's just the latest one in a long string of things.
He's fine in EDH, man. Don't worry. Keep going.
But yeah, I would say that while that is true that those things can slip through design, I think that ultimately having an occasional slip through versus having much more restricted design is better, I think, overall for the game. As long as the slip throughs are dealt with accordingly. I don't personally have a problem with things like restricted lists. I'm not talking about them right now. But people often think of restricted lists as, restricting creativity. Well, that's exactly what these Shadow Brutes and light classes and stuff are all doing, is they're restricting that creativity. When I play if I wanted to play Rhinar, for instance, I look at all of these shadow cards that I just can't play. And, there's nothing for me there. if they weren't shadow cards, so say that I could play them in Brute, and there might be one or two. Maybe I would play a one-off Endless Maw, or I would play a one-off Convulsions from the Bellows of Hell. But that would be interesting. It would be. I don't think it would be absurdly powerful. It would just give me more things to look forward to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree with you on that one. When I was looking at the set as a ninja one trick, I was like, oh yeah, light cards, shadow cards. Am I able to play these? Are we gonna like align ourselves to these certain talents, or I don't know. But yeah, once I realized that talents are fixed on heroes, I was just like, oh okay, well, looks like I can't do anything else for my ninja deck. So
Yeah, Ninja got nothing in this set, did it? Like,
well,
not even the generics. Does it? Do you have any generics that you want to play at all?
no, nothing that I can tell.
I mean, I think Frontline Scout's just generally okay, so maybe that. But
Yeah. Stubby Hammers might be good for Benji, I guess. I
Yeah,
don't
I
know.
was thinking about that, but honestly, the attack reaction is still pretty good. Cause
Yeah, I think ultimately this whole dichotomy between developer restricting cards versus players wanting to play cards that are restricted from them is kind of a ongoing debate between developer versus player freedom, where developers are more likely to design cards that they want to design when they have kind of stopgaps in place to ensure that the cards that they design don't end up breaking the game in half. Whereas players, meanwhile, definitely want to have more choices than not. And I think Fab definitely errs on the side of the developers more often than not.
yeah.
what I would say is, yeah. Sorry, you go,
No, no,
Oliver.
no, no. I was just.
I talk much more than you.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just thinking, like players are meant to break the game. That's why they have ban lists. That's all.
True. That is true.
Yeah.
And they definitely have shown that they're not avoidant of ban lists with the Drone of the Brutality ban either.
Yep. I totally agree with that one. As even though I played it all the time in Ira and Control Katsu, I agree with the ban.
Yeah, and I think most people, generally speaking, as long as ban and restricted lists are handled well, they're actually very positive for a game.
Yeah.
I was going to say that I think often, well, sorry, not often, but Yichin, you're saying a lot of the argument is for developer freedom, right? And that makes sense because obviously, if you have less variables to consider, you can design more freely and not have to worry about suddenly breaking the game in half, right? So that totally makes sense. However, the kicker is that if you just design more openly and allow players to explore, you can still put those artificial restrictions in through a restricted list, right? If need be. Say that I would say it's quite rare that you end up with, a whole entire set of cards that are all broken. I mean, I do remember the Chaos cards from Yu-Gi-Oh being an exception, but apart from that, generally speaking, it's only single or small interactions that end up being too good, or single outlier cards like Oko, like we talked about. And in those cases, you can easily just plug those cards away rather than gating a whole set of cards, if that makes sense. So if there was a problematic interaction, like say, for instance, that, I don't know, like Valiant, Thrust, and Bolt of Courage, I'd literally just pick the first two cards I saw, don't read too much into that, ended up being too good together. You could go for almost a Fantasy Flight game style restricted list where you can put restrictions and just say, these two cards can't exist in the same deck together. That's fine. Yes, it's an artificial restriction. Yes, it's not as clear to someone who's a casual player. But really, if we're talking about broken interactions, we're really talking about the competitive player, right? And they will keep up to date on those things. So I don't know. I would have preferred, personally, more open deck building, with the potential that if something goes wrong, they can restrict it or ban list it, rather than upfront restricted. Because that's what this is. It feels like an upfront restricted list.
Yeah, I get what you mean. One thing I'll note though is that with other games with restricted lists, they also have rotation or some other sort of format where they limit the number of cards that are available within each format. So as you add more cards and as the game gets older, the number of permutations of possible broken combinations of cards increases dramatically. And with every one, if you accidentally make some broken design that breaks one or two cards, or maybe like breaks 0.1% of cards, the more the game gets older, the more you'll have to ban, and eventually that ban list, if you are sticking with a no rotation idea, will need to be curated or modified in some other way, which is why a lot of games that start off saying that they're not going to have a rotation end up having a rotation, because it just gets too unwieldy for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what I would say is I agree with the idea that rotation, like without rotation, ban lists and restricted lists do become larger. I mean, I would look to Yu-Gi-Oh as an example of that, where I remember, like, for reference, I played Yu-Gi-Oh some like 15, 16 years ago, so that was quite a long time. But even at the time when they were like 8 or 9 sets in and there was no rotation, there was like a ban list of say 20, 30 cards. And over time, obviously, they move things on and off it, but it generally does just grow larger because there are individual cards which are simply too powerful. What I would say, however, is that actually in none of the Fantasy Flight games, and they have been restricted lists and ban lists, has rotation ever happened. They've talked about it. They've said that rotation would happen. They've unfortunately never lasted long enough for rotation to actually come into effect.
Didn't Netrunner have a soft rotation?
Actually, no, that's true. Netrunner, I think Netrunner lost their first cycle, and then the game ended. That was the only one where cards ever rotated. And again, that was only like 100 cards that went out of the game, out of like a 1,000 or 2,000 card pool. I can't remember how big it was. But yeah, so you are right. You are right that Netrunner did. But I don't think that any of the other ones ever have. I know I played Call of Cthulhu, A Game of Thrones, Legend of the Five Rings, and while they talked about rotation being introduced, it never actually came into effect. And they had restricted and banned lists throughout the life of the game.
So as a counterpoint to that, the games without ban lists, they have had steadily increasing power levels, or rather, the games without rotation have had steadily increasing power levels, where the number of, or what a deck needed to be a viable deck in competitive, the bar was set higher and higher, so that older decks that used to do well were shunted out. And that's partly a consequence of vertical design, and I think that's also partly a consequence of not making sure that, or not setting hard limits and just having a soft limit where you have tons of potential interactions. And not saying that's a bad thing, because I think I think that's a good thing. But I do see why a developer would want to limit that if they want to have control of the metagame and want to make sure that the power level is kept flat, so that somebody's deck that they have built for an internal format stays relevant for the next 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah. And I agree that is, I think it's certainly a consequence of vertical development, right? Because naturally, if you increase the number of options that someone has, they can theoretically make better decks every single time, right? Or they'll always be able to make an optimal deck from the card pool. And so over time, obviously, if you've got a sample size of, say, 10,000 cards, you're more likely, I guess, to have a very, very powerful deck than if you only had 100 cards, all things being equal. Like, obviously, if you make those 100 cards extremely powerful, it's going to be off the chain. But obviously, as time goes on, there are going to be, a card that's very marginally better than an old one, and then it replaces it. So I understand that over time, you are right in that it does mean that old decks that weren't good 5 years ago get phased out. Sorry, that were good five years ago get phased out. But is that such a problem? I don't think it is. If anything, that makes me continue to be invested in the game. So as an example, I'm an unabashed Ranger lover. Right? Not Azalea necessarily. Azalea happens to be the Ranger in the game. But I love Ranger. Ranger's really fun. So when there's a set or anything like that that basically has no cards or very, very few cards to input for me, it's just not interesting. And that's okay. I appreciate that sometimes there is going to be a set where there is not much for me. However, if there is a set, and I'm sure this will happen, where there might be a Fire Ranger or a Savage Ranger or whatever trait Ranger, that's just a lot of cards in that set that I can't use to modify my old decks. It's almost like when I'm looking at new sets, if I want to do anything, I've got to buy all of the stuff from the new set. Rather than getting a couple cards here or there to be able to tune my old cool deck. So it's like every single time a new set comes out, I'm building a new deck rather than improving an old one. Does that make sense?
True. But theoretically, if the power level is kept flat, you don't have to build a new deck, right? You can just pick up some of the cards that you want, and then your Ranger deck will theoretically be able to be on par with whatever Fire Ranger, Shadow Ranger, or whatever they release.
So I think that's true. Like, so if the power level is kept relatively flat, I mean, if the power level is kept the same as it is now, then Ranger will continue to be not great. But
Yeah.
but assume that all the classes were even. So I'm not concerned about individual balance. In fact, Ranger being the weakest is a bit charming for me. I quite like it. But then the problem becomes, why do I keep looking forward to sets for? Like, why do I continue to be a purchaser of cards? If that makes sense. Like, when I play a game, I like being invested in it. I like looking at new sets and wondering what cool new cards are going to come out for me. What, is there going to be something interesting? And if the continuous design just ends up being, well, there's actually nothing for you. And instead, if you want to enjoy the new set, you've got to just basically play a new hero or play something else. Then it just makes me less invested in the game overall.
That's exactly how I feel. I was just like, do I have to play these new heroes to play these new cards, or I can't do anything with my old deck because there's nothing I can use? But yeah, you explained it right on the nose, Kenny.
So I'll play devil's advocate for a bit and say that this is actually a big issue with when Modern happened in from 2014 to like 2017, where you had a very invested community that really liked the fact that there were only essentially 4 decks in Modern, and with every new release, maybe a deck got a couple new tools, one tool maybe, but the meta was mostly the same, and it was mostly a interactive format. And then as Wizards power creep through the sets by releasing new archetypes, new cards, new decks, and certain decks got extremely powerful, certain decks got amazing tools, especially with like Modern Horizons. The meta was upended, and a lot of Modern players left because they didn't like that the deck they had invested so much in was obsolete, and they were forced to buy new cards to compete. So if you keep it at a flat power level, right, you don't theoretically have to buy new cards to compete. But if you and you're basically introducing new archetypes that are theoretically again on the same level as the old cards. There's no excitement where you can get excited about the new cards, but for a lot of people, it's the fact that you don't have to invest and you can still play against interesting new decks without having to change your old ones. That was a lot of the appeal of 2012 to 2017 Magic the Gathering Modern format. And I feel like a lot of LSS probably feels the same way, because given how they market themselves about as like they have lots of Magic the Gathering experience and they were working on this game for 7 years, I do feel like that they're part of that crowd that didn't like the fact that Modern was essentially rotating.
I have a lot of respect for James White, the head of Legend Story Studios. I knew him a long time ago. He was actually part of the reason I got back into Magic, funnily enough. Fun little anecdotal story. He was he's a family friend of my stepdad, and he was over one day and he handed me a Ravnica, original Ravnica, not Return to Ravnica. It was was it Ravnica? Ravnica's the one with Boris in it. Yeah.
Yes.
So it was an original Ravnica tournament deck. Not a starter deck, but one of the tournament packs, the ones that they used to use for sealed. And that was actually what got me back into Magic at the time. So shout out to James for that. So certainly he does have a lot of experience, and you can see it, I would say, in the first 3 sets of Flesh and Blood. It was beautiful. Like, it's Flesh and Blood is a fantastic game. Should really clarify that with all of my criticisms of Monarch, they only come from a place of love, in the sense that I feel like there was something so good in those first 3 sets. In Welcome to Wraith, Arcane Rising, and Crucible of War. And Monarch, just some of the things that they've introduced, and he just seemed to be taking away from that beauty. That's my real fear. I don't know if it's going to end up being right. That was just the general feeling I got. We went on a massive tangent about traits, and we haven't even talked about many of the new cards.
Yeah, definitely.
Prism's being left alone, like she should.
Prism.
So
what do you guys think of Prism?
Yeah, actually, I think this is a great sequitur, because we were just talking about introducing new concepts and how they're add new dimensions to the game without feeling particularly overbearing. I think Prism, I'm iffy on her design, but I do like the concept of her class. And I do like that they're not afraid of introducing new classes. Maybe not from a symmetrical standpoint, but from a design perspective, they're not afraid to subvert expectations, even if I might not like the reason or the result of their subversion. But I think including illusionist so quote unquote late into the game is a very bold design choice, and I do think that the design of the class itself is amazing, both aesthetically and mechanically.
What are your thoughts, Oliver?
Based on the stuff that we've seen so far, she does seem like a pretty interesting class, but like I feel like she doesn't really have, how should I put it? She doesn't really have a great matchup against some classes, but has a super good matchup against others. So as a ninja one trick, as I've said before, trying to kill her freaking auras that have spectra, I just can't. Just no go again. Attack doesn't resolve. What do I do?
I mean, the only one you're really worried about on your turns is the one that gives everything -1, right?
Well,
everything else you can hit them first, and then once you're done beating them up, you just I'm gonna Kodachi your Spectra at the end of the turn.
Well,
that's it.
The problem is you need to first get to your mask chain link for 3, and the Kodachis really help with that. It depends, since I play a lot of control, I depend on those Kodachis to get to that chain link 3. And I usually don't have go again afterwards. As an aggro ninja, I play a little bit aggro ninja. I guess you can see it that way. Like if they like block your combo and you don't get a tutor with Katsu, then you can probably just Kodachi and take care of it. But the fact that there's so many auras that are just like must kill, that I just feel like I can get overwhelmed super easily. Especially if they have like extra action points through like a time stamp potion. They somehow play 2 auras. That's 8 resources. That's not likely going to happen. But if it happens, I feel like things can go pretty crazy.
Yeah, I think with Prism's design, she's meant to be relatively fragile. Like, right, most of her cards don't block for very much, and she has a lot of instants that don't block for anything. So she's going to be reliant on setup, and she's going to be reliant on making sure that you're constantly distracted, because as soon as you like turn your guns towards her, she's going to crumple like wet paper.
Yeah, I think we kind of saw that. Right? Yeah, we did see that in a little in the Blitz preview that they had like yesterday, 2 days ago. I don't remember. But
yeah.
But I mean, it was like a Blitz deck, so it wasn't like fully optimized or anything.
Yeah. One of the concerns I have with her design is that a lot of her cards seem like they're tailored to counter a specific type of deck, and I feel like during play there's a big chance that you'll draw the wrong half of your deck when you need it. So my concern is that while she has a good kind of, not really balanced, she's kind of, her cards are on 2 extremes, right? They're either really strong but also get wrecked by Brute and Guardian, or they wreck Brute and Guardian but don't do as well against classes that have go again. So there's a big sort of either I draw the right half of my deck or I draw the wrong half of my deck. I think it's a little lessened with the design of FAB, where you eventually just draw your entire deck eventually. But I can see there are going to be some turns where I'm like, I just drew 4 Phantasm cards, and my opponent has 2 6 attack power cards in his hand. I guess I'm just going to do nothing for the next 2 turns.
Blitz is a different story, though.
Yeah, so I totally agree. And I think, Oliver, what you were trying to talk about before was how polarizing her design is, in the sense that, and sorry, Yichin, you pretty much said that as well, where you have these cards which should just do absolutely nothing against certain classes. Like pretty much all of the Phantasm cards just do absolutely nothing against Brute and against Guardian. They just make them block with a card from hand, but that's it. So it's just like 1 to block 9 or 1 to block 7, etc. And it just ruins Prism's whole turn, right? So Prism in those matchups, I imagine, will have to rely much more on the weapon in order to do anything. Whereas in other matchups, and I'm thinking about the classes like Ninja and Ranger, for example, that don't inherently, in fact, I don't think Ninja or Ranger have any cards in class that inherently have 6 or more attack. And they're very rare. Like they'd be very, very off color in generic as well. Like you wouldn't really play a lot of them. Command and Conquer notwithstanding,
Yeah.
but every other 6 attack card is pretty much an inherent, is a very specific decision to play to counter Prism. But I can just imagine playing against Prism and just getting bombarded by, 9 attack, 8 attack, 8 attack with upside over and over again, just from, 1 or 2 cards in hand, because the attacks are not very expensive either. They're 1 or 2 energy, so she can easily block with 2 cards or 3 cards and play a massive Phantasm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that I think is not great. I talked about this as well a little bit when I talked about, well, I haven't talked about it yet today, but I've talked before about silver bullets. So in the set, there are a couple cards that only do something against shadow heroes or only do something against light heroes. And I think those designs are pretty poor. I'm just going to go out and say it. I really hate those type of designs. I don't mind designs where they're a little bit more generic. So the example we talked about was jokingly Impenetrable Belief, which reads, if 3 or more cards have been put into an opposing hero's banished zone this turn, Impenetrable Belief gains +2 defense while defending. Obviously, this is a card that is kind of slated towards countering the blood debt strategies. But at the same time, it has a really, really fringe application against dash builds, which boost a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they've boosted 3 times in a turn, you can actually block for 4 with it. Now, are you going to play this card just to counter Mechanologist? No. But the fact of the matter is, it's not purely a Shadow Hate card. In the future, if there are any other heroes or abilities that use the Banish Zone a lot, Impenetrable Belief might actually be good. Whereas, as an example, with Ray of Hope specifically mentions Shadow Heroes. That, to me, is just not as clean design as something that targets the mechanism rather than the trait.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. And so I think that Prism in a way is similar in the sense that she's going to be really, really strong in some matchups just because she kind of naturally has the hate for them, right? Like she has Phantasm, which is great against every go again style hero. But against Guardian and Brute, she's just going to walk in and fold.
I agree with you on the design of the specific light and shadow hate cards, but I think Prism's design is specifically much more general, right? There's always ways you can sideboard it, so it's not like if you're, for example, if you're playing a light hero, there's no counterplay against the Eclipse existence, whereas whereas if you're playing against Prism, there is counterplay for the cards you're worried about, and you do have access to them even if they may be subpar. So I think that she's definitely more of a response class in that whatever build she settles on will be in response to the dominant decks. So I think that's overall for the health of the game, she'll be better, but I don't think playing against her will be particularly fun, mostly because it's a question of, is she teched against you or not? That being said, there are a lot of matchups that feel that way already. Especially, and I'll give this as an example because it's pretty easy. Any wizard matchup, any class that uses a lot of blues already has natural tech against it, right?
Yeah.
So you already have kind of polarizing matchups with wizard and with Runeblade, I suppose, because they rely on arcane damage as well against certain heroes. And Prism just feels like an extension of that, where she has strong matchups against certain heroes, and she can tech her. But she has the flexibility of being able to tech for specific builds.
Yeah, I suppose that's not untrue. She is more similar to things that already exist in that way. I don't dislike Illusionist's design overall, to clarify. I actually quite like Illusionist. I think that she's pretty cool. I think some of the art on her cards is easily the most gorgeous in the game.
Yeah, I just want to shout out to Genesis, because that stuff just made me go, wow, this is the first time I saw it.
Yeah, it is beautiful, absolutely gorgeous art, and some of the best name. I think Phantasmaclasm, for example, is probably the best named card in the game. But yeah, there's just I'm always cautious of very, very polarized matchups, just because I think sometimes I like every game to feel like a game, and I'm just concerned when I see cards like this that there is the potential to walk into a lost matchup, and then the individual games are being fun.
That being said, it's something that you have to keep in mind when preparing for a meta, right? So you can consider that a measure of skill, where if she is a rogue deck in the meta, then obviously that's probably the worst spot for her to be in, because she'll just come out of nowhere, beat you up, and then you'll feel like, well, I couldn't have prepared for this because 0 people play Prism in competitive matches. But if she is a known force in the meta, you can be like, okay, I do expect this, so so I should bring some tech to counter this, or I should expect some of it. I think that when you have a known meta, it's actually better for a lot of competitive players than a unknown meta, because it's not as good for viewers, obviously, but for the players, you have the ability to tech and to play offbeat strategies to catch people off guard, because people expect things and you can subvert those expectations.
The meta becomes a game itself. Yeah, you can certainly subvert expectations, and I do agree that well, it's not exactly, you didn't directly say this, but it's kind of what you're hinting at with the metagame stuff, is like rock paper scissors styles metas. But that's really the ultimate goal, I think, of what design should be, is that you have a constantly fluctuating meta where different things are good at different times, even with no changes. It just depends on what's prevailing and popular. So obviously, just to give an easy example, say that everyone in the meta chooses to play rock and you turn up with paper, you're probably going to have a good time. And that's fun. But if everyone starts turning up with paper because everyone's turning up with rock, all of a sudden it's good to turn up with scissors, and so on and so forth. So even though there's been no changes in the card states per se, there is just simply the fact that a certain deck is popular, which causes a change in the meta. And that's good. So Prism, in that sense, is good, because she probably would represent one extreme of that, right? She could be scissors, for instance. Scissors to Ninja and Ranger's paper. But then, if now that she's scissors, in comes Brute and Guardian as rock and just crushes them. So then they'll disappear from the meta, and then the hope would be that something would come in to beat Brute and Guardian, and so on and so forth. So I would agree that it's good for a healthy meta, but it just makes individual matchups less interesting sometimes. Like, again, if you're playing a burn deck in Magic, just as an example, I know lots of people seem to hate references to Magic, but I'll just use it because most people at least understand it. If you're playing a burn deck in Magic and you run into the one guy in the room playing a life gain deck, you're just in for a bad time. Like, there's just no way around it. You are in for a sucky game.
Yeah. So I keep on bringing up Magic. So hopefully
everyone hates us.
Are okay with that. But I think the ideal spot for a rock paper scissors metagame to be in is more on the lines of 65-35 matchups rather than like 80-20.
Yes, absolutely.
And with Prism's design, I understand the concerns of our resident Ninja and Ranger players have with Phantasm. But since she can be both scissors and paper, depending on her build, I don't see her matchups going particularly skewed in one direction, because the card pool that she has to tech against you is relatively minimal, and especially with a lot of the Phantasm cards, most of them are barely stronger than Guardian or Brute cards. And I understand they're cheap and they require less cards.
Yeah, they're cheaper.
Yeah. I think I don't know. I don't feel as much of a threat coming from her Phantasm cards than I do from her Spectra cards, because I think the main way she'll get advantage is by having 1 or 2 auras out and the opponent being unable to respond to them fast enough, and her just going crazy with Phantasm cards because they no longer have Phantasm, or their cards are too weak to block because they're all getting subtracted power. That I think is where her optimal state is. And I don't see Ninja and Ranger having too much of an issue preventing her from reaching that optimal state.
You know what I realized? Her auras are instant speed.
Yeah, they're instants.
Holy crap.
Yeah, when I first read them, I thought they were garbage, because I thought they were actions, and so you just use your whole turn to play this 4-cost card, and then next turn your opponent just whacks it, and you can't stop it or anything. But no, they're instant, so you pretty much always get a trigger because you play them at the end of your opponent's turn.
Yeah. Yep.
And then you get 1 trigger off them at least, so that makes them playable. I'm not too concerned about the principle. I think it's an interesting-ish playstyle. But I will also say that I don't know how I feel about the whole permanence thing. I felt like this when Mechanologist came out as well. one of the interesting things that I think about FAB that makes it so different from other games is that the gains in momentum are always temporary, right? So when you're ahead on, there's no like ahead on the board. There's a head on cards in hand and who's the aggressor. And that's a very really interesting part of the game because even if you're behind on life, you can still come back. Yes, it's bad because you don't have your life resource to fall back on, but you can come back because you're not just overwhelmed by a board state. But it does feel like Mechanologist is an example with, and I mean, you can see how competitive Mechanologist was with all of its permanent upgrades, right? Like with, why can't I think of it now? The Go Again, Pistol Games Go Again.
Induction Chamber.
Yeah, that one. So, you know, think about the games where someone drew 3 of those early on, or, you know, they started 1 and drew 2. How lopsided are those games? And the answer is very, right? Like, it's just the fact that they have permanent upgrades that you can't really undo. Unless you have Arg Smash, but, you know, that very specific card notwithstanding. So permanents worry me a little bit. At least with Prism, you can answer them, and everyone bar Wizard can answer them.
Yeah, speaking of polarizing Wizard matchups, poor Wizard. Prism has a handful of blues and like 3 auras out, and all I can do is like, I don't know, pitch a couple of things to deal with 4 damage or something.
Yeah, just cry. Really, is all they can do. On it, I think we've talked to death the design of the set and all of these different things. I think we could probably use a bit of some positive stuff as well. So
yeah, definitely.
I'm thinking more. What are you most excited for in the set, or what heroes are we most excited for?
Okay, so we were already talking about Prism, so I just want to say I love the Angel aesthetic, and I think that Prism will maybe not be. Even if she isn't popular, I think she'll remain a fan favorite just because of how interesting she plays, and how much she changes the game plan of heroes going against her compared to other heroes. So I think she'll be super popular, and I do love her design.
Yeah, she reminds me a little bit. One thing I think LSS does really well. Also, LSS. I mean, it's the artist doing the art, but obviously LSS is commissioning specific pictures. I was going to say one thing I think they do really well is depictions of women. I was going to say. So, for example, like both Prism, Azalea, Dash, and Dorinthia, they're all like very well represented women. I mean, I'm a dude. That's just what I kind of think, but it's not the kind. They don't fall into the fantasy tropes of like scantily clad. And the angels as well are a good example where none of them look particularly sexualized. They look tough, or they look, you know, Herald of Rebirth looks pretty. But that's clearly kind of part of that design aesthetic. Whereas you look at Herald of Ravagers or War-Tuned Herald, and they look vicious. They look like war angels. So kind of shout out on that art end. I know it's not particularly about the gameplay, but that's something I think is quite good. And Prism and Dash particularly really stand out as really fantastic art pieces.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I enjoy about LSS is character design, not just for women, but for in general, is that they are conscious of overlapping aesthetics. I know with some of the Crucible of War heroes, they do overlap, especially with Kaio and Reinar. But for the most part, all the main set heroes have unique aesthetics, designs, and personalities shining forth from their card frame design and from their card design that do fit in the world together, but are so visually distinct that a Prism deck just looks visually so different from a Reinar deck that I love it just because it appeals to the sort of customizable this deck is my deck aspect of the game, where you have
that ownership.
The ownership of the game, where it feels like this deck is just perfect and just right and looks great. So that's myself for Prism. I actually wanted to go over a couple of the other heroes. We'll skip over Bolton for now, mostly because I'm not super keen on Bolton, just because I'm kind of sick of Warrior. But
okay, I'll get back to him later.
I want to go over the shadow design, specifically how well they are able to distinguish shadow cards, shadow Runeblade cards, and shadow Brood cards, aesthetics-wise. One of the big things is that one of my big concerns about talents is that if you have just a single aesthetic or color palette for a talent, once you add like 3 or 4 heroes, they kind of look kind of samey, right? There's not many. Like if you have like a fire hero, you can maybe come up with like 3 or 4 different like designs that before you start going to like the overlapping designs where, oh, this guy's head's on fire, oh, this guy's body's on fire. That's kind of it's easy to overlap designs within a color palette. And with Shadow Brute and Shadow Runeblade, they went in opposite directions where Shadow Brute is more flesh and gore horror, whereas Runeblade is more leaning towards cosmic and psychological horror in their card art. And I love that distinguishment. I think that it shines better than the light warrior versus light illusionist distinguishing features. And honestly, it just looks great. Like I have no problems telling the difference between Shadow Brute and Shadow Runeblade. And I do like how much care they put into that to differentiating these two heroes. Sorry, that was
you're good.
rambling for me.
All right, what are you looking forward to, Kenny?
Well, I am looking out of all of the heroes, funnily enough, I'm actually looking forward to Bolton the most. I probably won't play him, but it kind of is in line with a lot of the stuff that I talked about, where I just feel like he is the most consistent design with what already existed. If I can, Illusionist, I don't have a problem with either. Illusionist, I accept as a new class. That's not really an issue. But I would say, in order of my liking stuff in the new set, Bolton is my favorite, followed by Prism, then Chain, and then Levia. I think Bolton's really interesting. I think there's actually a lot of crossover with cards that will be good with him and good with Dorinthia as well. I think that's more the case than with Runeblade and with Brute, where they do have very separate card pools. That might just be because warrior cards are just so damn good. So I can really see Bolton, going for a weapon build rather than a full light attack build. But I can also see him going for a light attack build. I mean, my thoughts were ultimately trying to set up, the big turn of V of the Vanguard, Luminar Ascension, the chest piece that you sack, a Courage of Bladehold, and two of the swords. But not going for the axes, but actually just going for multiple free sword attacks in a round.
Can I offer you some Valiant Dynamos as well while you're at it? Because those things are crazy.
So, I actually don't think that's going to be that great. I think, and some guy on the Discord was talking about this earlier. I know, great source, right? But with the current feat that they have, Refraction Bolters, a lot of the strength of Refraction Bolters comes from the threat of being able to activate it. And it allows Dorinthia to play a lot more mind games with the opponent. Whereas with this one, since it's purely defensive and it's consistent, I think it'll be better in classes that have dual wield weapons, but I don't think Dorinthia will actually want to drop Refraction Bolters over this.
Oh, yeah. I agree.
I agree.
Yeah, I was thinking more about Kasai. I know Dorinthia likes her Refraction Bolters. I don't think they're gonna drop Refraction Bolters or Valiant Dynamo. I just think Kasai is gonna have a better matchup against Ninja, in my opinion, because being able to block that one Kodachi every turn, because she already has like so many inherent go again effects for her weapons. It doesn't need a hit to gain go again, it doesn't need a hit. So I feel like that's gonna bring Kasai up in the Blitz meta, in my opinion, but we'll see.
Yeah, and definitely, I think she needs it, just because not because she really needs. We need another warrior, but because I think it's just good to have heroes in the same class with distinct strengths and weaknesses that, even though they're drawing from essentially the same card pool.
Yeah, they feel like distinct heroes.
Yeah, definitely. Like Kasai is not budget / knockoff Dorinthia anymore. She has her own build. She doesn't use the same equipment. She has different style of build, even more so now, and she has different matchups that just affect how she does in every tournament.
Sorry, Kenny, were you done?
I mean, Bolton. The summary of it is, I like Bolton because he's similar enough to the core heroes that he feels like he could have been part of the game from the start, which is something I really appreciate in design. I think Luminar Ascension and V of the Vanguard are both pretty exciting cards. That's Yeah, that's pretty much it. I can imagine some pretty cool combos of them and him just having pretty insane turns, which I think are fun. Um, and I think it comes into the fact that overall, I prefer Charge and the way Soul works compared to Blood Debt. Charge and Soul feel more like they are naturally part of the game than Blood Debt does. Not that I have a massive problem with Blood Debt. I actually generally quite like Faustian pack style mechanisms. So things where you trade a massive downside for a massive upside. Like my favorite Magic card of all time is Abyssal Persecutor.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I think it's so cool. Again, with the Magic, I apologize, everyone.
I mean, that's our
But
backgrounds.
Brute in the first set, for example, I played Brute, which felt like that as well. Because Brute, you had all your random discard that you had to mitigate and try and play around. So it felt like you were trading something for more power. So yeah, I like those mechanisms, but just Bolton. Bolton is pretty cool.
Yep. So for me,
What about you, Oliver?
oh yeah. So for me, I know Yichin's gonna play because me and Yichin play together a lot. I know Yichin's gonna play Shadow Rune Blade. So to finish off that light versus dark aesthetic, I know I'm gonna be playing either Light Warrior or Prism. So it depends on what we open, honestly. But I'm honestly leaning towards Light Warrior more because I like the attack reaction type gameplay where you can like mind games them into overblocking
Yeah,
or
I
doing
feel
something
like
dumb.
your type of play style, you like being in control,
Yeah.
and making opponents react to you. Whereas I do prefer, I kind of prefer both, but I do like the idea of having an answer for everything my opponent does.
Yep. Yeah, that's why I have my control Katsu is pretty cookie cutter, so that's how I like to play. Can handle almost any matchup. But yeah, the warrior Bolton design looks very interesting. Having attack actions instead of depending on your weapon is a good change of pace for the class, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of the problem will be being able to consistently get stuff in soul, because that limits the kind of amount of non light warrior attack actions that you're able to put in the deck.
The one thing I'm afraid about Soul is how efficient are the cards? Because most of the time, I see like there's Valiant Thrust where it's like if you charge this turn, Valiant Thrust gains 3 attack. I know that's like every card should be about 3 damage and 3 defense, so that kind of averages out. But like V for the Vanguard, right? Attacks you control on this combat chain gains +1 for each light cards charged this way. You have to be spending a lot of light cards in order to gain multiple, to attack multiple times to like even out. Otherwise, you're going to be losing out on card advantage, in my opinion. But we'll see how it plays.
The key thing though is it's not actions, right? It includes your weapon attacks.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, you still need like the go again for those weapon attacks as well. So that's also more cards. But yeah, we'll see.
But I mean, you do that with your with Sir Bolton himself. You just use his stuff to give him the go again.
And then the hatches can gain more power over until end of turn. Yeah, I get it. We'll see.
It's almost like it's his specialization or something.
Oh, nice. All right.
So speaking of which, I want to actually, since we're going over charge, I want to actually take a note that unlike other sets, pretty much every keyword introduced in this set, and there are a lot of keywords introduced in this set, but every like class mechanic introduced in this set reads as a downside rather than an upside. And coming from a background of like other card games where it's kind of like a taboo to have a keyword be read as a negative, I feel like that's an interesting change of pace, and I do think that's a subtle but bold design choice with Monarch.
I don't know if charge and soul read as negative though. Because they're always May abilities. I don't think May ever reads as negative, if that makes sense. I do agree that certainly Blood Debt and Phantasm and Spectra arguably is a downside. I mean, obviously it has its upside of staying in play, but I do get what you're saying in that they're all conditional bad things happen.
Yeah. Well, with charge, it's like you read a card that just says you may charge your hero's soul, and it's just like, why would I ever? If you had no context with it, you'd just be, why would I ever do this, right?
Yeah.
And it's only after learning the full picture do you understand, okay, this is why I want to charge, and it actually seems pretty good when I do that. And I think that's a pretty interesting aspect of Flesh and Blood design in general, where you have heroes that essentially have a core package and function very well within the core package, even though the individual cards themselves might be weaker than normal or different than normal. And I guess it also ties back into the whole kind of design where we have cards that are essentially read as X specialization, even though they're not really.
Right.
But yeah, that's actually kind of what made me turn around on the idea of talents. Is just the fact that they're willing to. I guess I feel kind of lowbrow when saying this, honestly, because I usually don't like it when people just subvert expectations just for the sake of it. But I am kind of impressed that they would do it. I do think it's a very daring move on their part.
I do enjoy the terminology of bold and daring and everything. It's like I'm impressed that they would be so daring to do this. Like, wow, they printed a Fable that was playable in every deck. It's very bold.
It's bold. Yeah. It's how you can turn any sort of negative situation to be a positive sounding one just by adding. It's a very bold choice, or they had the courage to do this, right?
That's how I use the word interesting as well. I'm like, that was certainly an interesting choice.
How about those mentors though? Nah, I'm probably not going to get into that. We don't have a lot of time, so winding down.
That's okay. Mentors we'll have to talk about another time.
Yeah. So winding down. What do you guys have any future predictions for like FAB in the future, or have we gone over it already?
Ooh, I guess I can lay out some specific ones for me. I predict Kingdoms, even though I don't want it to. I predict Kingdoms will introduce 2 new talents. And I do think they'll cover at least 3 of the classes that they're missing. And unfortunately, Ranger is not going to be one of them.
How dare you?
Sorry.
That's all right. Long maligned. That's how I like it.
Other than that, I have a great amount of hope that the supplemental set, whatever it's called, for this kind of block, will introduce light heroes and shadow heroes with no classes.
Interesting.
That's about it.
That's bold, dude.
Yeah, that would be very bold of them. It'd certainly be a very interesting decision.
You know my theory about mechanologists being a talent, right? They've already introduced mechanologists, so hey, who knows?
With all the borders being the same.
Yeah.
It's pretty far-fetched. I'm not entirely sold on it yet.
Okay. That's fine. I'll bet you a Fable on it.
If we can open one.
Yeah, of course.
Steve opened one.
Yeah.
But that's not ours.
What about you, Kenny?
My predictions, look, in spite of all of the stuff, obviously I sound a bit like a negative Nancy. I think Flesh and Blood will still do really well with Monarch. I think there's going to be a lot of people who are very excited by the set. On a competitive from a competitive standpoint, my suspicion is that the light classes are going to succeed more than the shadow. But if either of the shadow classes are going to succeed, I think it's going to be Shadow Runeblade, not Shadow Brute. I think Shadow Brute's a little bit too straightforward. It almost feels like a budget Rhinar, honestly, like a Rhinar with extra steps. Whereas Runeblade does feel quite distinct from Viserai. Other than that, predictions for the future, I don't know what Kingdom is going to bring. I'm hoping that it does introduce 2 new traits. And I'm hoping that it probably goes down a path of like 3-in-1 again. That I don't mind. I think going down the path of doing 4 pre-existing classes would be odd because there'd just be one class that's flat missing. And, depending on what that class is, I can imagine there being a lot of angst. But yeah, my hope is that they continue to introduce traits. I think if they continue with the light shadow, which I do have a slight feeling they might do just because of what seems to be the flavor of Monarch, and then just that seems to be what it's going for.
Yeah, Kingdoms is very thematically similar to Monarch, so who knows?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'd be worried. I would be a little bit worried if they continued just down the light shadow path, mainly because then, in the next block, are they going to introduce 2 new traits? And then, then it's an age away until you get more stuff for light. But I don't know. Maybe that would be all right. I have to think on it more.
Yeah,
Oliver?
I was thinking 2 new traits for sure. But since it is like Kingdoms similar to Monarch, I'm not sure. Now that you guys have said it. I was kind of hoping like they would do like a man versus nature with like Matrix versus Savage Lands or something. But now
That's what it's hitting at in lore. I think they have the Savage Lands creatures invading the pits, which is right under metrics. So who knows?
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, I don't really have any like big predictions. I just want like a Savage Lands Raider. So, sorry, Savage Lands Ranger.
Oh,
Yeah.
here's a good question for you guys. What's your favorite card in the set so far? I guess for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah. I was gonna come back and ask what the okayest card in the set was in theme with
Going
our,
in theme.
in theme with our podcast. Yep. And what is my favorite card in the set? Get back to me in a second. I'm just scrolling through the list to look.
Okay, sounds good. Oliver, do you want to say anything?
The most okayest card? Huh.
Or the best, or both.
I'm
gonna think of both.
Yeah, I never actually thought about it because I can't play any of these cards.
Okay. I'll mention mine. Because I think I have some interesting ones. So okayest card in the set, I would have to say Dreamweavers, mostly because I feel an affinity towards it. I like it, but I'm not exactly sure why I like it. It's just a normal like equipment that is just kind of just there, but for some reason, I think it's pretty cool. For best card,
is that the illusionist equipment?
That is illusionist equipment. The illusionist gloves that make things.
Yeah.
Phantasm. Yeah, I'm not sure why I like it, but it's just nice. For best card in the set, I would have to say either Galaxy Black or Convulsions from the Bellows of Hell.
Of course.
Just because I love saying the name. It's just so nerdy and so blatantly 90s like edgelord that I just love it just because of how cheesy it is. And Galaxy Black is an interesting name too. Not because it sounds like a stripper, which kind of, but also because it's just, I don't know, the fact that they use two X's for some reason, no reason whatsoever, as far as I can tell, on like half of the Shadow Runeblade cards. It's just so cheesy that I just love it.
Fair enough. That makes sense. Okay, so best card in the set for me. So I think that the best card in the set is probably Triple Enlightened Strike. That's my thought. I think that is going to be pretty defining. Celestial Cataclysm. I was talking about it the other day, and I was just mentioning, like, it just seems to be the case that, of course, it costs 0. Of course, it pitches for yellow. Of course, it defends for 3. So even when you can't play it, it's still an okay card to have. I was talking about, why couldn't it be red? Why couldn't it block for 2? So if there is some kind of cost to it, where if you draw it and you don't have the setup, it's bad. But no, it's solidly fine. So that I think is probably, in my opinion, the best card in the set. The most okay card in the set. What would be the okayest card? Probably Endless More, honestly. Endless More, I look at it and I'm like, it's good. It's fine.
Yeah.
I think doesn't do anything particularly exciting. It's 9 for 3. Basically, it's a poor man's Alpha Rampage. But yeah, that's fine. I played Wreck-A Romp. No, that was solidly okay. I would happily play Endless More. There you go.
Yeah, I think for me, it's probably like Tome of Divinity. You pitch 2 cards, you draw 2 cards. Woo! But yeah, for now, I'm still holding my judgment because we still haven't seen the Light Illusionist Legendary or the Light Legendary. Also, we haven't seen like any of the generic mythics. Majestics.
Yeah, so. You be careful with that magic talk.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely a no-no.
Yeah. So we'll see what they give us. All right. Well.
Okay, sounds good.
Are there any social plugs that you guys want to add at the end?
No, I have no Patreon. I have no YouTube channel, so no need to subscribe. No need to like. I don't know. Thanks for watching, I guess. Or listening.
Yeah, I mean, they might be watching. They can watch our little icons pop up when we're talking.
True.
Yeah.
Well, I also don't have a Patreon. But if someone would like to donate money towards me, I can start a Patreon.
We're very organized. We're just okay at this.
Yeah.
Solidly okay.
Yeah, I don't have anything either. I hate social media.
Excellent. We've done well.
Honestly, I'd prefer if they spend money, if you guys, whoever's listening, spend money on the game. That'd be perfect. Don't spend money on us. All right. Well, I think that concludes the first episode. Everyone, thanks for listening. Hopefully you guys come back for another one where we just ramble on for another hour.
Hour and a half, I believe.
Hour and a half?
Yeah, it was quite a while.
Dang. I just sat here and nodded for an hour and a half. All right. See you guys later.